Settling the Pacific. For years, scholars have puzzled over a mystery in the Pacific. How exactly did humans reach the thousands of islands scattered throughout the Pacific world? While we don't know all the details, evidence suggests that people from Southeast Asia originally settled the Pacific Islands. Over tens of thousands of years, these people and their descendants slowly migrated throughout the Pacific. Thanks to expert canoe building and navigational skills, these settlers reached islands many thousands of miles apart. If you look right here, you see stick charts. Stick charts like this one from the Marshall Islands were probably used to navigate from island to island. The sticks show the directions of waves and ocean currents. Shells indicate the location of islands and other landmarks. Many long-distance voyages were likely made on double canoes built with two holes carved from huge logs. And as you can see, this is a double canoe. Double canoes used one of two sails and could reach speeds of up to 25 miles per hour or 41 kilometers per hour. Double-hulled canoes likely included a shelter to store food, seeds, and other essentials. So, 3 waves. The Pacific world was settled in 3 main waves. People from Southeast Asia migrated first to Australia and New Guinea. Over thousands of years, migration took place from Southeast Asia and New Guinea to the islands of Micronesia and West Polynesia. In the last great wave of migration, Polynesians settled New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. And if you look at this map, it'll show you the first wave of migrants in purple, the second wave of migrants in blue, and the third wave in orange. As we read the following chapter, I want you to think about the following questions. First question I want you to think about is, into what regions are the Pacific Islands divided? And if you look over here at this map, it will kind of tell you exactly how these Pacific Islands are divided. Why might high islands have larger populations than low islands? Okay, so why might high islands have larger populations than low islands? What is a territory? Why did other countries seek to control the Pacific Islands? Why do you think that many Pacific Islanders continue to practice traditional customs? That's another question you need to be thinking about. Also, what economic resources are available in the Pacific Islands? Think about that as well. And lastly, how might the Pacific Islands be affected by global warming in the future? So think of all these things as we read. The Pacific Islands. If you live there, you live in a small island in the South Pacific. For many years, the people on your island have made their living by fishing. Now, however, a European company has expressed interest in building an airport and a luxury hotel on your island. It hopes that tourists will be drawn by the island's dazzling beaches and tropical climate. The company's leaders want your permission before they build. Will you give them permission? Why or why not? Physical geography. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Scattered throughout the ocean are thousands of islands with similar physical features, climates, and resources. Island regions. We divide the Pacific Islands into 3 regions: Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Based on their culture and geography, Micronesia, which means tiny islands, is located just east of the Philippines. Some 2,000 small islands make up this region. South of Micronesia and Melanesia, which stretches from New Guinea in the west to Fiji in the east, Melanesia is the most heavily populated Pacific Island region. The largest region is Polynesia, which means many islands. Among Polynesia's many islands is Tonga, Samoa, and the Hawaiian Islands. Physical features. The Pacific Islands differ greatly. Some islands, like New Guinea, cover thousands of square miles. Other islands are tiny. For example, Nauru covers only 8 square miles, or 21 square kilometers. Geographers classify the islands of the Pacific as either high islands or low islands. High islands tend to be mountainous and rocky. Most high islands are volcanic islands. They were formed when volcanic mountains grew from the ocean floor and reached the surface. The islands of Tahiti and Hawaii in Polynesia are examples of high islands. Other high islands, such as New Guinea, are formed from continental rock rather than volcanoes. For example, the country of Papua New Guinea, located on the eastern half of the island of New Guinea, has rocky mountains that rise above 13,000 feet. Low islands are typically much smaller than high islands. Most barely rise above sea level. Many low islands are atolls. An atoll is a small ring-shaped coral island that surrounds a lagoon. Wake Island, west of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, is an example of an atoll. Wake Islands rise only 21 feet, 6.4 meters above sea level, and covers only 2.5 square miles, or 6.5 square kilometers. All but 2 of the Pacific Island countries lie in the tropics. As a result, most islands have a humid tropical climate. Rain falls all year and temperatures are warm. Tropical savanna climates with rainy and dry seasons exist in a few places, such as New Caledonia. The mountains of New Guinea are home to cool highland climate. Resources in the Pacific Islands vary widely. Most low islands have thin soils and little vegetation. They have few trees, and other than the coconut palm, in addition, low islands have few minerals or energy resources. Partly because of these conditions, low islands have small populations. In contrast to low islands, the Pacific High Islands have many natural resources. Volcanic soils provide fertile farmland and dense forests. Farms produce crops such as coffee, cocoa, bananas, and sugarcane. Some high islands also have many mineral resources. Papua New Guinea, for example, exports gold, copper, and oil. So here is a picture of what an atoll looks like. So the formation of an atoll. The Pacific Islands are home to many atolls or small coral islands. that surround shallow lagoons. Coral reefs are formed from the skeletons of many tiny sea animals. When a coral reef forms on the edges of a volcanic island, it often forms a barrier reef around the island. As the volcanic island sinks, the coral remains. Sand and other debris gradually collects on the reef surface, raising the land above sea level. Eventually, all that remains is an atoll. Over time, sand collects on the surface of the reef, allowing grasses and shrubs to grow. When the island is submerged, the reef forms an atoll, or a ring of coral islands surrounding a lagoon. So you can see how there's small little islands right here in a circular motion. Coral reefs will sometimes form along the edges of volcanic islands, creating a ring around the island. As the island sinks into the ocean floor, the coral grows upward and forms an offshore barrier reef. So that's kind of how you see these islands are formed. History and culture. The Pacific Islands were one of the last places settled by humans. Because of their isolation from other civilizations, the islands have a unique history and culture. Early history. Scholars believe that people began settling the Pacific Islands at least 35,000 years ago. The large islands of Melanesia were the first to be settled. Over time, people spread to the islands of Micronesia and Polynesia. Europeans first encountered the Pacific Islands in the 1500s. 2 centuries later, British Captain James Cook explored all the main Pacific Island regions. By the late 1800s, European powers such as Spain, Great Britain, and France controlled most of the Pacific Islands. Modern history. By the early 1900s, other countries were entering the Pacific as well. In 1898, the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. As a result, Guam became a U.S. territory. A territory is an area that is under the authority of another government. Japan also expanded its empire into the Pacific Ocean in the early 1900s. In World War II, the Pacific Islands were the scene of many tough battles between Allied and Japanese forces. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the United Nations placed some islands under the control of the United States and other allies. In the last half of the 1900s, many Pacific Islands gained their independence. However, several countries, including the United States, France, and New Zealand, still have territories in the Pacific Islands. Culture. A variety of cultures thrive throughout the Pacific Islands. Some culture traits, such as fishing, are common throughout the entire region. Others are only found on a specific island or island chain. Close to 9 million people live in the Pacific Islands today. Most Pacific Islanders are descendants of the region's original settlers. However, the population of the Pacific Islands also includes large numbers of ethnic Europeans and Asians, particularly Indians and Chinese. Many ethnic Asians are descended from people brought to the islands to work on colonial plantations. On the Melanesian island of Fiji, for example, Indians make up nearly half of the population. Before the arrival of Europeans, the people of the Pacific Islands practice hundreds of different religions. Today, most Pacific Islanders are Christian. In Melanesia, however, some people continue to practice traditional local religions. Although modern culture exists throughout the Pacific Islands, many people continue to practice traditional customs in parts of Polynesia. For example, people still construct their homes from bamboo and palm leaves. Many Pacific Islanders today continue to live in ancient villages, practice customary art styles, and hold ceremonies that feature traditional customs and dances. The Pacific Islands today. Many people imagine sunny beaches and tourists when they think of the Pacific Islands today. Despite the region's healthy tourism industry, however, Pacific Island countries face important challenges. The countries of the Pacific Islands have developing economies. Fishing, tourism, and agriculture are key industries. Some countries, particularly Papua New Guinea, export minerals and timber. The region's isolation from other countries, however, hinders its ability to trade. The environment is an important concern in the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands are used for nuclear testing grounds from the 1940s to the 1990s. Many people fear that one effect of these tests may be health problems for people in the region. Global warming also concerns Pacific Islanders. Some researchers believe that rising temperatures may cause polar ice to melt. The rise in ocean levels would threaten low-lying Pacific Islands. Summary and preview. The Pacific Islands are one of the most isolated regions in the world. As a result, unique cultures and challenges exist in the region. In the next section, you will learn about another isolated part of the globe, Antarctica.